Namaste and a very good morning, India. Welcome to The Explainer, where we cut through the noise to bring you the stories that are truly shaping our nation today. We're here to give you calm, clear, and factual news with all the context you need to really understand what's happening. So let's get right into it.
All right, here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're starting with politics, power, and the courts. Then we'll dive deep into the economy's battlegrounds. After that, we'll take a look at our nation's social fabric, see where India stands on the world stage, and finally, we're going to end on a high note by celebrating India's champions.
So first up, let's head straight into the corridors of power. We're looking at a fascinating mix of political chess, major legal rulings, and some fundamental questions about our rights, all things that are going to shape our country for a long, long time. We're kicking things off with a really high-profile judgment out of the Delhi High Court that really gets into the weeds of transparency versus privacy for our public figures. The court just overturned a 2016 order from the Central Information Commission, the CIC. That old order had told Delhi University to release the records of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 1978 Bachelor of Arts degree, all under an RTI request. But now the High Court has flipped that. It's set a new precedent, basically ruling that a person's educational degrees are their personal information. And what that means is they don't have to be disclosed under the RTI Act unless someone can prove there's a really compelling, overriding public interest. So for now, that degree is officially off limits for public RTI requests. So what's the logic here? Well, the entire decision really boils down to this sharp line the court drew between two very different ideas, public interest and what it called public curiosity. This is really the heart of it. The court basically said public interest is when information is crucial for holding our leaders accountable, for making our democracy work. Think information about corruption or abuse of power. On the other hand, the court defined public curiosity as just a general desire to know something about a public figure, without any direct link to their job or a clear benefit to society. In this case, the court decided that asking for the degree was more about curiosity than a genuine public interest. It's a huge ruling, and you can bet it's going to add a lot of fuel to the debate about where we draw that line between our right to know and an official's right to privacy. All right, staying in the political arena, our next story points to a pretty big change in strategy over at the Election Commission of India, the ECI. They've just announced a new, much more proactive game plan. Get this, they've held almost 5,000 structured meetings with political parties in just the last 6 months. Now, we're not talking about just a few phone calls here and there. The sheer number of these meetings and the fact that they're formalized tells us that the ECI is starting to see its own role differently. It's a real shift from just being a distant overseer to becoming a much more active participant in the process. So, what's really going on behind this change? Well, it looks like the ECI is consciously trying to reinvent itself. For years, we've all seen the ECI as a sort of referee, right? They enforce the rules, they call fouls when they see them, they hand out penalties. But this new strategy? It's more like they're trying to be a mediator. The idea seems to be that by talking constantly, by having these structured dialogues, the ECI can get ahead of problems, stop controversies before they even start, and cool things down when it comes to hot-button issues like EVMs or campaign rules. It's a smart move from being reactive to being proactive, all in the name of building more trust in our entire electoral system. And speaking of the ECI, here's a fascinating twist, where the courts are stepping in. The Supreme Court has just granted protection from arrest to a very well-known psephologist, Sanjay Kumar. Now, if you're not familiar, a psephologist is an expert who analyzes elections and voting data. And he needed protection because the Election Commission itself had filed 2 FIRs against him, claiming he'd spread misinformation online during an election. Kumar, who is a respected academic, argued that his work was just research and analysis. So the Supreme Court stepping in to shield him from arrest is a really big deal. It highlights that constant, tricky balancing act between fighting fake news and protecting free speech and academic freedom. Okay, now for a ruling from the Supreme Court that is, frankly, huge. This one could affect millions of workers across the country. The court has sent a very powerful message. It has declared that the government, when it's acting as an employer, has to follow the principles of fairness in our Constitution. It can't just act like a private company trying to slash costs. And the court said it loud and clear. Outsourcing cannot be used as a means of exploitation. Wow. This is a game changer, especially for the millions of people in the gig economy or working on government contracts. The court is saying the government has to be a model employer. It can't hide behind complicated contracts to deny people basic rights or fair pay. This ruling sets an incredible precedent, making it clear the government has a duty to ensure dignity and justice for every single worker, permanent or not. From the courts, let's jump back into the political ring.
Former Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal is taking aim at Home Minister Amit Shah over a new bill that's being proposed. Apparently, this bill would lay out the rules for how a government can run if one of its ministers is in jail. Kejriwal is publicly questioning why this bill is needed right now, but he also pointed out what he sees as a massive hypocrisy in politics today. He said, on one hand, parties are talking about laws to stop ministers from governing from behind bars, but on the other hand, those exact same parties are often rolling out the red carpet for leaders who are facing serious criminal charges, just as long as they haven't been convicted yet. It's a really sharp political jab meant to shine a light on how parties can have very convenient and contradictory stances when it comes to crime and politics.
And over in Jammu and Kashmir, former Chief Minister Mehbooba Mufti was recently seen leading a protest in Srinagar. Her main demand? She wants Kashmiri prisoners who are currently in jails all over India to be brought back to prisons within the Union territory. Now, her argument is a humanitarian one. She says that when prisoners are held so far from home, it's almost impossible for their families to visit them, and that, she argues, is a violation of their rights. But looking deeper, this is also a very calculated political move. By taking up this really sensitive and emotional issue, Mufti is trying to fire up her core supporters. She's putting herself back in the spotlight as a defender of local rights, and it's a cause that really resonates with a lot of people in the region.
All right, let's switch gears and talk about the economy. In this section, we're diving into the stories that are shaking up our markets, our businesses, and of course, our wallets. First up, we've got a massive story about one of India's most well-known and lately most talked about startups. The edtech giant Byju's is in legal hot water again, but this time, the opponent is a global heavyweight, Qatar's sovereign wealth fund. We're talking about a massive state-owned investment fund. They filed a lawsuit against both Byju's and its founder, Baiju Ravindran, right here in the Karnataka High Court. And this couldn't come at a worse time for the company, which is already under a microscope for its finances and how it's run, both in India and around the world. And the numbers involved here are just staggering. Take a look. $235 million. That's the amount the Qatari fund is trying to get from Byju's. This comes from something called an arbitral award, which is basically a binding decision made outside of the formal court system. Now, here's what's really telling. A massive sovereign wealth fund like Qatar's usually likes to handle things quietly, behind closed doors. For them to go public and file a lawsuit to get this money, it screams that trust has completely broken down. It tells us that all the back-channel talks have failed, and now they're using the full force of the Indian courts as their last option. This sends a seriously bad signal to other investors and just adds to the storm clouds gathering over Byju's. Okay, let's move on to a really interesting peek into how the war for our daily commute is changing. For years and years, if you talked about Uber's biggest rival in India, the answer was simple. It was Ola. It was a classic showdown, right? A two-horse race for the four-wheeler market. Well, that's not the story anymore. In a recent statement, Uber's global CEO actually named a new #1 rival in India, Rapido. And this isn't just some off-the-cuff remark. It's a huge strategic admission that the entire battle for getting around in India has shifted. The fight isn't just about cars anymore. The real war for customers, for daily rides, and for the future of city transport has moved to two-wheelers and three-wheelers. That's where the affordable last-mile connectivity is, and that's what most Indians need every single day. Now for some important news from the Reserve Bank of India. There's a lot of nervousness in the air about potential new trade tariffs from the United States, with a 25% hike on some goods that's supposed to kick in on the 27th. So, to try and calm everyone down, RBI Governor Sanjay Malhotra made a public statement. He promised that the central bank is ready to step in with financial support and liquidity for any Indian industries that get hit hard by these tariffs. So what's the strategy? The RBI is basically telling everyone, don't panic, we've got this. We'll be the economy's shock absorber. It's a preemptive move to settle the markets, show stability, and make it clear that there's a plan to handle any economic damage from these trade disputes. Okay, we're now moving into our third section, where we look at our nation's social fabric. These are the stories that go beyond the headlines about politics and business. They touch on the very core of who we are as a society, our biggest challenges, and our attempts to create real change. Let's start with a number that just makes your jaw drop. 59,000. That's not just a statistic, that's 59,000 young people, 59,000 futures thrown into chaos because of massive technical failures in the Staff Selection Commission's online exam system. And remember, the SSC is the biggest recruiter for government jobs in the entire country.
So, in response to this total mess, the Commission is now completely rebuilding its entire exam process from the ground up. And one of the biggest changes will be making Aadhaar, our biometric ID, mandatory, hoping to make the system more secure. This isn't just a minor fix, it's the SSC hitting the emergency reset button to try and win back the trust of the millions of young Indians who depend on these exams. This next story is incredibly tough to talk about, but it's one that absolutely has to be told. It comes from Greater Noida, and it's a horrifying reminder of a social evil that just won't go away. A 28-year-old woman named Nikki Baki was allegedly burned alive. The accusations are against her husband and his family. And according to Nikki's own family, this wasn't some sudden act of violence. They say it was the horrific final chapter in a long story of harassment and abuse. They allege that her in-laws had been demanding a dowry of 36 lakh rupees and were constantly cruel to her because they didn't get it. It's an absolutely heartbreaking story that shines a harsh light on how dowry-related violence is still a tragic reality in parts of our country. So, how do we even start to make sense of a tragedy like this? Is it just another terrible dowry crime, another number to add to a grim list? The analysis we're looking at pushes us to see it through a deeper, more sociological lens. It asks the question, is this just a dowry crime, or is it a violent clash of ideals? The argument is that this isn't simply about greed for money. It's about a deadly collision between two completely opposite worlds. On one side, you have this deep-rooted, brutal patriarchy that sees a woman as property, as a transaction, and sees dowry as a right. And on the other side, you have the rise of modern women with their own agency, women like Nikki, who are educated and independent and who refuse to be treated like an object or a source of money for their in-laws. It's when that modern agency pushes back against that unmoving wall of patriarchal entitlement that the conflict can, and in this case, tragically did, become fatal. It reframes the whole issue, not just as a crime, but as a violent symptom of a much deeper struggle happening in our society right now. Okay, let's zoom out now for our fourth section and take a look at India on the world stage. We'll check in on some key foreign policy moves and also touch on some major global events that are making waves everywhere. We've got a lot packed into this slide, so let's break these global stories down one by one. First, right here in our own neighborhood, something pretty interesting happened between India and Pakistan. You know, the Indus Waters Treaty is suspended, diplomatic ties are basically frozen, but despite all that, India officially warned Pakistan about a possible flood threat because of rising rivers from heavy rains. What this shows us is that even when the politics are incredibly hostile, the simple reality of geography and the need to save human lives can still open up a line of communication. It's a small but important moment where humanitarian needs won out over diplomacy. Now, let's head over to Europe. NATO has just promised another $50 billion in military aid for Ukraine. That's the same massive amount as last year, and this comes right at a time when there's more and more talk about possible peace talks. Well, the thinking is that these two things are connected. This huge aid package isn't just to keep the war going, it's to make sure that if and when Ukraine gets to the negotiating table, they can do it from a position of strength, not desperation. Next, some truly devastating news from the Middle East. An Israeli airstrike on Nasser Hospital in Gaza has reportedly killed at least 20 people. And what makes this even more tragic is that among the dead were 5 journalists from different international news outlets. An attack on a hospital is always a tragedy, but when it also kills the very people who are there to report the truth to the world, it becomes an assault on truth itself, making it even harder for any of us to understand what's really happening. And finally, a quick look at the US, where President Trump has signed 2 very controversial executive orders. One is about prosecuting people for flag burning, and the other goes after cashless bail systems in some states. Civil rights groups have slammed both of these as unconstitutional. The general take is that these moves are less about actual policy and more about political theater. They're classic culture war tactics designed to fire up his base before the next election. And now for our final section. You know, after wading through all the complex politics, economics, and some really tough social issues, we're going to end this briefing on a much-needed high note. It's so important to also focus on the moments of achievement, resilience, and good news. Let's celebrate some of India's champions. We've got a fantastic triple header of good news to share, so let's get into it. First, a big win for Indian diplomacy in the Pacific. India and Fiji have just signed a major defense action plan, but it wasn't all just about military might. They also signed 7 other agreements covering everything from cricket coaching and student exchanges to healthcare. The bigger picture here, this is India playing some very smart geopolitical chess. It's using a mix of hard power with a defense deal and soft power through things like cricket and education to strategically push back against China's growing influence in that part of the world. Next, a moment of pure sporting glory. Our Olympic silver medalist, Mirabai Chanu, just made an incredible comeback after being out with an injury for a long time. And she didn't just compete, she absolutely dominated, winning the gold medal at the Commonwealth Weightlifting Championships.
That comeback gold is so much more than just a medal. It's a huge statement about her amazing resilience, her mental strength, and it proves she is still one of the absolute best in the world. And finally, some brilliant news for sports lovers all across the country. The Sports Ministry has announced that National Sports Day is going to be expanded into a huge 3-day nationwide celebration. The idea is to create a real festival of sports and fitness, not just a one-day event. This is a big push to make physical activity a more central part of our national culture, which is so important for tackling health issues like diabetes and heart disease.
And this quote right here really sums up what we're all about: fostering thinkers, not followers. We've covered a ton of ground today, haven't we? From a court ruling's fine print to huge economic shifts and heartbreaking social issues. So here's a final thought to leave you with. Looking back at everything we discussed, which of these stories that are maybe flying a bit under the radar, like the ECI changing its strategy, or the Supreme Court's outsourcing rule, or that new defense pact with Fiji, which one do you think is going to have the biggest, most surprising impact on India a year from today? Just something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow to help you make sense of it all once again. Follow us on Spotify and YouTube to listen to this podcast every morning at 8 a.m.